What's the first thing you think of when you see and hear this? For a lot of people, it'll be something iconic in genre of the fighting like Resident Evil or Street Fighter. For others, it'll be something a bit more recent like Monster Hunter or Phoenix Wright. If you love your action games, there's the things like Onimusha or Devil May Cry. For the slightly older crowd, there's the many different iterations of Mega Man. Capcom are known for a lot of iconic and fascinating properties, but they're also home to many cult hits, such as Rival Schools, United by Fate. Rival Schools was one of Capcom's earliest attempts at a 3D, fully polygonal fighting game at a time where the industry was starting to transition from 2D backgrounds and sprite work, yet also during a time where 2D fighting games were at their most expressive and beautiful. To put this into some context, Rival Schools was originally released in 1997, the same year that Capcom released the last Darkstalkers game, Vampire Savior, and the first two versions of Street Fighter III, all of which ported 2D hardware in some amazing ways. On a basic level, Rival Schools doesn't try to push 3D in ways that feel like a gimmick. You can move in and out of the background, but that's just about it. It does take advantage of the space to allow you to pop opponents into the air, juggle them, sort of like the Versus Series aerial rave mechanic. It also shares some DNA with Street Fighter, featuring a countering system that's similar to the recently introduced Alpha counter system, but it stands out on its own thanks to two key factors. The first is the game's emphasis on teamwork. Much like with the Versus games, you select two characters to battle it out, but unlike in those games, you can't tag out during fights, you play rounds with one character at a time. Think of it like SNK's King of Fighters series, but only just kind of. Instead, the second character acts more like an assist, and depending on the character, actually can do more than just a team-up attack. Some characters offer healing abilities, while others can offer you more charges on your super meter. Hell, even one in particular can even do damage to you if you're feeling frisky. The neat thing about this is, if you ever feel like switching it up, you absolutely can. At the end of every round, you have the option to switch characters and see how both characters work as a primary and secondary. It's a good way to encourage you to try out the cast and see what team combinations work best. The other factor is that Rival Schools, for a fighting game in the late 90s, actually has a plot. It's something that's actually featuring as an element of the game, as opposed to being just a throwaway thing to justify the theme. Every fight in the arcade game has a brief story interlude between fights, and even if the story itself isn't the greatest, it's far more of an effort than most games of its era. And justifying that story is actually a pretty exciting cast. Sure, they're more or less a collection of archetypes and tropes, but they're all super exciting and fun to play as. You've got your shonen hot-blooded protagonist, your cool-headed school council member, foreign exchange students, biker gangs, overly excited PE teachers, and even a certain schoolgirl that made her debut only a year prior. On top of that, the game does wonders with its personality, especially when the team-up attacks are as fun and vibrant as they are here. And yet, that isn't what makes Rival Schools truly memorable. Where the game really stands out is its amazing and weird PlayStation port. Compared to other fighting games at the time, Rival Schools' port stands out as being more than what you'd expect, not just because of how it attempted to convert an arcade game to the PlayStation, but how it attempted to expand upon the original release in one of the most unique and interesting ways possible. Because you see, Rival Schools doesn't come on just one disc, it comes on two. Two discs for a fighting game. The first disc, the arcade disc, is fairly straightforward. It's more or less a complete port of the arcade game, retaining all the story cutscenes between fights, even adding voiceover during your segments. Unlike in the arcade version, you can freely choose your characters if you don't wish to engage the plot, and you've got a few hidden characters to play as. The second disc, known as the Evolution disc, is a bit more interesting. It too has a version of the arcade game, just without all the story cutscenes, but it makes up for it from a lot more in terms of mode and content. To put this into perspective, most fighting game ports at the time would never really have much more than a versus and training mode. If you're lucky, you would have like a league or a tournament mode. Hell, even most Capcom ports didn't go as hard as Rival Schools did at the time. Clearing the game with multiple characters and difficulties unlocks extra mini-games and modes that are a fun distraction and a good alternative to the fighting action. Aside from the aforementioned league and tournament modes, which are pretty cool, there's even a full-blown tutorial mode that actually goes through the game mechanics, which was almost unheard of in the late 90s. Yet even that's not the craziest thing this game has. The Japanese version of the game includes what effectively amounts to a school simulation mode. Not a school life, it's more or less kind of a visual novel, kind of a dating sim, that kind of thing. You play as a customized character, join one of the 5 schools in the game's world, and take part in school activities over the course of a year, developing relationships with the other members of the cast. Once you've completed it, you can take that customized character into the game proper and battle it out. It was so successful that Capcom even released an updated version of the game that not only included more characters, but expanded on this school life mode. There was a rumor that Capcom were going to bring this mode over to the Western version of the game, but didn't due to the requirements of the translation at the time. The only hint of it ever existing in the Western version are the 24 bonus characters you can unlock, which are more or less the custom characters you can play as in that game. All this is important because up to this point, Capcom had a reputation for some less than stellar fighting game ports to the PlayStation. It's especially painful as this was at a time where they were at their creative peak when it came to the genre. If it wasn't understandable things like animation frames or sound clips being cut due to technical limitations, it was removing fundamental mechanics and changing the core of the game. So as an example, the legendary Marvel tag team fighters of the time famously dropped the tag mechanic for their PlayStation 1 ports, leaving the second character as a glorified assist that you couldn't select. It totally changed the feel and vibe of the game, and these versions are by far the ways you do not want to experience them. What helped is the arcade version of Rival Schools was designed for hardware that's more or less similar to the original PlayStation. Sort of like how Namco had an arcade port that was kind of the same thing, which basically resulted in arcade ports that didn't feel as compromised and actually really close to the original game. Granted, the PS1 port doesn't look quite as nice or handle the sound, and there is more loading, but playing it on PlayStation, well, Rival Schools is weirdly enough pretty close to its arcade counterpart, and that's kinda something. Sadly, Rival Schools doesn't really leave that much of a legacy. Arguably the biggest thing about the game was it was only the second game to be directed by a guy called Hideaki Itsuno, a man who would go on to not only direct some great fighting games, but also redefine the action genre and take it in some fantastic directions, but also in some divisive ones. Over the years, Itsuno said he wants to make a new entry in the series, but given his interest in how long it takes the man to make anything these days, not exactly holding my breath here. Rival Schools did spawn a sequel, however, known as Project Justice in this part of the world. It was an arcade and Dreamcast game which continued the story and introduced some cool new characters. Mechanically, the fights are now 3-on-3, which means you now have a second assist and another character to switch between during rounds. You also have the ability to interrupt team-up attacks in a quick minigame, which adds to the tension and excitement of each fight. Unfortunately, that's the last time we'd see any of the Rival Schools cast or plot in their own game. In the years since, a handful of characters in the series have more or less been relegated to either appearances in crossover games, or show up as cameos or references in others. Neither Rival Schools or Project Justice have been re-released digitally in any form, save for a Japanese PlayStation Store release of the original game. But maybe the future of the series is a little brighter. Capcom recently announced that Akira from the series is joining Street Fighter V in 2021, making her the first character who debuted in that series to join the prestigious fighting game franchise. At the end of it all, Rival Schools is the perfect game to be called a cult hit. It's got some great mechanics, a cool cast of characters, and enough personality that it's lasted through the years as part of the Capcom fighting game universe. It's left its mark in more ways than one, and if anything else, gave us a fantastic home port that felt way ahead of its time. With Capcom still going through something of a renaissance, I doubt we'd ever get anything new from the franchise in this day and age, but of all the fighting games and franchises to pull something from, Rival Schools is definitely one of the cooler ones that more people should be aware of. 生きてゆくその笑顔の中